Good morning. This morning we're talking about raised beds and strategies for building raised beds. I think a lot of people, when they think about a raised bed, they think about the structural process of building it. Where are you going to get your raised bed? Perhaps you're buying a pre-made raised bed, or where are you going to get the materials to build your raised bed? And then they think, fast forward to this idea that they're going to have a garden there. They probably have already planned what they want to plant in that garden. This is all well and good, but it's important to actually think about the whole process when you're putting in a raised bed, because it's a semi-permanent structure. It's going to be there for a while. It's going to change your landscape somewhat. And so you need to think about this in kind of a methodical way. Otherwise, you might make bad decisions. So I'm going to tell you today the strategy that I use for placing raised beds. When I moved to my property back in, well, I guess it was early 2018 now, I took some time before I built permanent structures. And so that is really important if you're thinking about things with sort of a permaculture mindset, but even if you're thinking about things from just a very practical point of view, you want to think about, where is your sunlight coming from? Where is pollution coming from? Where is the wind blowing? What direction is the wind blowing? How am I going to get resources to this garden? Because a garden takes resources. So you want to think very carefully about siting your raised bed. And you want to think about the space that it's going to take up and how that's going to affect the space around it. It's really important to build a level raised bed. So that's a really important thing to think about. If you have flat landscape like I do, you may feel like you're in luck and you can just put your raised bed down wherever you want. That might be the case, but there are some benefits to working on slope, and that is that if you build say a terrace, which is it's kind of a form of a raised bed. If you build a terrace below a slope, you will get a couple of things coming down that slope. One of those things is water. Another thing is nutrients. So if you're trying to, say you rake up all your leaves and you go over them with a lawnmower, and then you want to put that leaf mulch, use that leaf mulch in your garden. Very easy to do if it's at the bottom of a slope. So thinking about that in terms of your design, what location is this going to be in, and how does that affect the input and output of this raised bed. So you also want to think about the materials you're going to use. Now, for my purposes, I used two different types of materials, and they were a combination of what was available to me and what was practical and quick. Because, in the springtime, building something, I didn't want to take too much time. Once I knew where I wanted it and knew how I wanted to build it, didn't want to take too much time in the construction. So two types of materials. I used pallet wood for some of my raised beds, and so that was going out and searching for pallets in the community, pallets that were not treated with chemicals. And so you have to make sure you find pallets that are marked HT, they're heat treated rather than chemical treated. And those are generally safer for building your raised beds. They don't have arsenic and other stuff that you really don't want to get into your soil. So that was, I actually got this pallet breaker, which helped me to take apart the pallets. You don't want to take apart pallets without a pallet breaker. So you can see here how easy it is to take apart a pallet with a pallet breaker as compared to when you are going at it with a hammer and a crowbar. That's a really laborious project. You're going to lose a lot of your wood just from splitting. This way you save a lot more of the boards. And it's only like 30 or 40 bucks to buy a pallet breaker. This is one of the best investments I ever made in terms of gathering free wood afterwards. So what are the materials I'm going to use? The other materials that I used were landscape blocks, and those can be bought for a couple bucks a piece, and about yay big, and they just sit in a row, and you can stack a couple of rows on them. And by defining that space, you have immediately defined your garden in a way that, in my front yard and in spots in my backyard, I also kind of want to have aesthetically pleasing spaces. If I were out in the country, if I were building things like hugelkulturs and lasagna gardens that were not contained, I wouldn't worry so much about this. But I'm in a neighborhood. I want to respect my neighbors. I want to, and also just have a place that I'm excited about aesthetically. And so these were the two methods that I used. The pallet wood was turned into the box, one of the boxes you can see here. I also actually cheated at one point and got some boards from the lumber yard that were used for, I can't remember what they're called, but they're used basically for replacing sections of roofing in roofing jobs. And these boards are super inexpensive. They're also not really that resilient. So you have to consider how long you're going to need this raised bed. And so using those boards, I don't really recommend. But you can also find scrap lumber in other places. And I would really advise you to look for scrap wood because it's readily available, free to use, and it really doesn't put any impact on the environment. It's like a positive, turning that back into something that's useful. So more thoughts that you want to do and that you have in terms of planning your garden. How are you going to build your soil for this bed? And this also relates to what you're planting in the bed. So what soil, you're creating a new system here, so you get to decide from day one how you're going to build it and what you're going to use. The limitations you'll have probably have to do with money. So filling a raised bed with certain kinds of compost can be expensive unless you're going to make your own. Are you going to be able to let this bed sit for a year? So perhaps you could put lots of manure in there, which would be a great boost for your garden, but might need a little bit of time to sit and cool down before it was ready for planting. Can you get wood chips? And can you get those delivered by arborists, or will you have to buy them? Can you get compost from your city's composting program, or do you need to make it? And there's always buying soil in bags. It's expensive, it's wasteful, but sometimes you just need to do what you need to do to build your garden, and you might make that choice. So I would suggest looking at other alternatives before you go to that. So once you've determined how you're going to build your soil, you've probably by this time thought about what you're planting in it. Is this going to be a perennial bed or an annual bed? And so that goes into this soil building process. It's going to be an annual bed. You might want to lean more toward a pH closer to the middle of the pH range, so closer to a 7. Whereas if it's going to be a perennial bed, you might want to go a little more acidic than that. And those things can be adjusted to a certain extent by adding more large, chunky matter to your soil and adding more wood to your soil, that sort of thing. So in the form of wood chip mulch or buried wood. I tend to bury old wood underneath my my garden bed. So things like old fence posts that were not painted, were not treated, but you can cut into sections. Fence pickets. I have a lot of that stuff from removing some of the structures that were on my property before I bought it. And so I can bury those things underneath the soil, and they will turn into more soil as they eventually break down over time. So just different ways that you can build your soil and fill that space underneath, and make sure you've got a good layer of topsoil so your roots can be established. But think about something that you can add to it that will feed it over time. And if you're building, like I say, a perennial bed, you're not going to want to disturb this. So you're going to want to put more of that perhaps in the soil. And also by putting more carbon sources in the soil, it will tend to become more acid, not necessarily very acid, but more acid. And that will help the fungal growth that supports the perennials that you want to be planting there. If you're planting annuals, once again, focus on more compost, and that will feed your annuals perhaps a little bit better. But it's a combination of both in both situations. You want to look into that. So that's something you've got to plan. One thing people don't often think about, or some people do, but many people don't, is how are you going to use the vertical space above your raised bed? And how can that be incorporated into your raised bed design so that, if you're growing things that are viney, or if you're growing things that will need support, how are you going to give them that support? Is it going to be a trellis that runs through the middle lengthwise down your raised bed and has strings coming down it for, say, tomatoes or pole beans, that sort of thing? Is it going to be a kind of a tent structure over the raised bed where you might grow beans up the sides and something in the middle? That vertical space is very valuable to you because it takes that, you only have 2 dimensions on the top of your raised bed, but when you add that 3rd dimension of space, which you will anyway by plants growing, but if you add more of it, you can add 6 feet of vertical space to your raised bed, and then you can grow more stuff. Because if you plant things that work together where, say you've got, beans in this and they're growing upwards, but you can also grow things below, like, perhaps lettuce or other kinds of things. Or if you're doing a perennial bed, then you can even think more about that, guilds of plants that go together. We can talk more about guilds in a later episode, but it's just something you might want to think about for your raised bed. So you want to plant, you're planning what you're planting at this point. So that's the next thing you want to make sure that you've thought about. And finally, and I'm not listing these things sequentially because all of these things should be going through your mind sort of back and forth through the time that you're thinking about this. How are you going to get water to this thing? Now, I wanted to use the space in between my walkway out front and the street. And so I put raised beds out there, and I didn't think that carefully about the challenges of getting water to those raised beds. I sort of knew in the back of my head that I could put a little irrigation line across the walkway, which I did, and covered that with a sort of safety strip. But it's awkward. I wouldn't give up those raised beds, but I do wish there were another way to get water out to them, and maybe I can strategize that in the future. So that's something that you can think of, though, in advance of your, installing this raised bed. How is the water going to get there? And that might have some impact on where you place your raised bed. So it's kind of an important thing to think about. So I've covered a whole bunch of things here. I'm going to go right back over them quickly so that you can write them down if you want to. So these are the things you need to think about. So first, where are you going to put this raised bed? And that is determined by some of the other things we'll talk about. What materials are you going to use? How will you build your soil? Is this going to be an annual or a perennial bed? How will you use vertical space in this, what can be a 3-dimensional structure? What are you going to grow? Maybe I already said that. And how are you going to get water there? And once you have answered all those questions, then you have designed probably a pretty good raised bed. Now, the one thing I didn't mention is there enough sunlight? And I suppose that's important to mention, and that's something that I haven't had to think about for the last few years, but I used to have to think about it a lot. In fact, I built a triangular raised bed at one point in time because that was where the sun was. And it just made more sense for me to build it in a triangle because I knew that the other half, if I made it a rectangle, I would have a whole section of the bed that just wouldn't get enough sunlight for what I wanted to plant in that raised bed. So sun, really important to think about. And the other energies in your system, you know, the wind that comes through, and I already mentioned water, all of these things that are going to contribute to making this a success or potentially just a big waste of your time. So if you plan your raised bed carefully, it will be successful and you can grow all kinds of great things in it. I've got 3, 4, 5, like at least 6 areas of my yard that can be defined as raised beds. And I also have lots of containers and things like that. And so this is a strategy that you can employ where you can expand your growing space to spaces that you might not otherwise be able to grow in. And so I hope you'll give that some thought. And I really appreciate your watching me today. Hope you give me a thumbs up here, and please leave a comment below and subscribe to my feed. I've been doing a marathon of video making recently, and getting your comments, getting your support has really been helpful for me. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Have a great day.